Most people think the American interest in buying Greenland is a joke. They see it as a vanity project, a real estate mogul trying to put his name on an island the size of Mexico. If you look at the headlines, it's framed as personality politics, ego versus sovereignty. That is a comforting narrative, but it is technically incorrect. If you strip away the tweets and the diplomatic outrage and look strictly at the logistics, the United States isn't acting out of ego. It is acting out of necessity. We are witnessing a resource-determinism algorithm running its course. The global system is shifting from a software-based economy back to a hardware-based one. And in that new architecture, Greenland is not a country. It is a stranded asset. It is a massive battery pack and a logistics hub sitting unguarded in the North Atlantic. Washington's logic is cold, precise, and entirely based on the physics of scarcity. Think of the North Atlantic as a motherboard. For the last 80 years, the connections were stable. But now the thermal paste is failing. Literally, the ice is melting. And the primary components for the next generation of industrial machinery are missing from the US inventory. We are talking about the raw inputs for high-performance magnets, guidance systems, and energy storage. Currently, the supply chain for these components routes almost exclusively through China. To a strategic planner, this is an unacceptable single point of failure. Greenland represents the only viable patch. It holds one of the densest clusters of critical minerals on the planet. The attempt to purchase or control this territory is not about expanding borders for the sake of a map. It is an attempt to secure a proprietary GPU stack before a competitor integrates it into their own system. In this briefing, we are going to reverse engineer the geopolitical logic. We will look at the mineral geology that acts as the hardware constraint, the changing fluid dynamics of the Arctic Ocean, and the political utility of manufacturing a crisis. We are analyzing the machine, not the personalities. If you want to understand how the global system actually functions beneath the media noise, you need to update your own processing algorithm. Make sure you are subscribed. Let's look at the subsoil data. There is a common misconception that rare earth elements are actually rare. They aren't. They are relatively abundant in the Earth's crust. The engineering problem is density and separation. Most deposits are low grade, meaning you have to process massive amounts of ore to get a usable yield, which creates an enormous waste footprint. The myth is that the US can simply open mines anywhere to solve its dependency on China. It cannot. The geology dictates the ROI. You need specific concentrations of heavy rare earths, elements like dysprosium and terbium, which are critical for the permanent magnets used in EV motors and precision-guided munitions. This is where the Greenland anomaly comes in. The island isn't just rock. Structurally, it is a geological vault that has been frozen shut for millennia. As the ice sheet retreats, it is revealing a subsoil composition that is statistically abnormal compared to the rest of the crust. Let's look at the specs. The Tan Breeze project in southern Greenland is estimated to be one of the world's largest deposits of heavy rare earths. In the world of critical minerals, heavy is the high bandwidth category. These are the elements that allow magnets to operate at high temperatures without losing their magnetic field. If you are building a fighter jet or a wind turbine, you cannot run the system without them. Additionally, we have the Amitsoq deposit, which is rich in high-grade flake graphite. Graphite is the anode material for lithium-ion batteries. The European Raw Materials Alliance backs this, and the US Geological Survey has identified Greenland as a potential supplier for nearly 24 critical minerals. To Washington, this looks like finding a fully stocked warehouse attached to a house you used to ignore. The geology is eudialyte-hosted, which is technically difficult to process, but the sheer volume potential changes the strategic calculus. Here is the glitch in the current system. Right now, even if the US mines rare earths domestically, the processing capacity is bottlenecked in China. China controls roughly 60 to 70% of mining, but close to 90% of the processing for certain high-value magnet materials. They have built the refining infrastructure while the West outsourced it. This creates a dependency loop. Washington frames the purchase of Greenland as a way to break this loop, effectively attempting to buy a raw material source that is geographically closer to home. However, owning the dirt does not mean you own the magnet. The trap is assuming that territorial control equals supply chain security. Without the refining infrastructure, which creates radioactive waste and massive pollution, the ore in Greenland is just rocks. But the US logic is to secure the asset first and figure out the processing architecture later. The proposed patch for this vulnerability is aggressive state intervention. We are seeing the US Export-Import Bank issuing letters of interest for hundreds of millions of dollars to support mining projects like Tanbreeze. This is Washington's first major overseas rare earth mining investment signal. It indicates a shift from free market sourcing to state-directed resource acquisition. They are treating the periodic table as a matter of national security. The strategy is to turn Greenland into a proprietary extraction zone, a battery pack for the NATO alliance. This ignores the local environmental regulations and the harsh reality of Arctic logistics, but the intent is clear. Lock down the resource to prevent Chinese state-owned enterprises from gaining a foothold. It is a preemptive denial of service attack on China's supply chain expansion. If you think the minerals are the main driver, you are looking at the wrong layer of the stack. Minerals are just static assets. The bigger problem is that the map itself is physically changing state. The ocean around Greenland is turning from a solid to a liquid. This doesn't just change the weather, it rewires the entire operating system of global trade. We are about to see a routing update that makes the Panama Canal look like a dial-up connection. Let's analyze the fluid dynamics. For human history, the Arctic Ocean has been a frozen wall. It was a barrier to entry. As the global temperature rises, that ice is receding, converting the Arctic from a barrier into a bridge. This is the physics of phase transition applied to economics. The Northern Sea Route, which runs along the Russian coast, and the potential transpolar sea route, which cuts straight across the center, are opening up. These routes are not theoretical. Commercial vessels are already testing the transit windows. A ship traveling from East Asia to Europe via the Suez Canal takes about 45 days. Via the Northern Sea Route, that latency drops to 20 days. In logistics, cutting transit time by 50% is an efficiency gain that alters the viability of entire industries. It reduces fuel burn, emissions, and capital lockup. Greenland sits at the intersection of these emerging lanes. It is the shortcut tile on the North Atlantic Monopoly Board. As traffic increases between the Pacific and the Atlantic via the Arctic, Greenland transitions from a remote outpost to a central switching hub. Ships emerging from the Arctic Circle pass Greenland to enter the Atlantic markets. In network topology terms, whoever controls this node monitors the traffic. This is why the US view is shifting. It's not just about what is buried in the ground. It's about where the island sits relative to the new flow of goods. If you control Greenland, you hold the keys to the new Suez. If you don't, you are leaving a critical choke point exposed to competitors who are actively building icebreakers to exploit these routes. The vulnerability here is what military planners call the GIUK gap: Greenland, Iceland, UK. This is the naval choke point that Russian submarines must pass through to threaten Atlantic convoys. During the Cold War, this was the primary defensive line. Today, that line is being reactivated. The US maintains the Pitafik space base, formerly Tula, in northern Greenland. This is a critical node for missile warning and space surveillance. However, as the region becomes navigable, the security requirements expand from aerospace to maritime surface control. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is pushing for a polar Silk Road. They want access to these routes and the resources. If a strategic rival builds dual-use infrastructure, ports that can host warships, in Greenland, the US loses its buffer. The trap is assuming the Arctic remains a neutral zone. It is rapidly becoming a contested theatre. The US protocol for this scenario is area denial. By asserting control or heavy influence over Greenland, Washington aims to lock the gate before the traffic spike occurs. It is similar to buying the land around a future highway exit. The strategy is to integrate Greenland into the North American defense architecture so tightly that no other power can plug in. This explains the urgency. The ice melt is non-linear. The access windows are opening faster than predicted. The US realizes it cannot afford to negotiate access rights on a case-by-case basis. They want route access to the territory to install radar, sonar arrays, and logistics bases without asking for permission from Copenhagen or Nuuk every time. They are trying to future-proof their control over the North Atlantic corridor. So, we have the hardware, the minerals. We have the network, the shipping lanes. But there is a third layer to this system that most analysis ignores: the crisis itself. The friction generated by trying to buy a country isn't a bug, it's a feature. The administration is using the conflict over Greenland to install a new operating system at home. It's a technique called external friction for internal consolidation, and it's one of the oldest plays in the book. We can call this the Donroe Doctrine, a mix of the Monroe Doctrine's sphere of influence and modern transactional leverage. Publicly, the rhetoric is about not letting China take it. It's framed as a protective measure, but if you parse the official documents, specifically the recent national security strategies, the language changes. It shifts to resource security. The myth is that this is a diplomatic negotiation. It is not. It is a unilateral declaration of economic zones. The administration is blurring the line between commercial interests and national survival. By designating graphite and dysprosium as essential for national security, they bypass standard trade protocols. This allows the executive branch to use emergency powers, allocate defense budgets to mining projects, and justify aggressive foreign policy maneuvers. The crisis with Denmark serves to highlight the urgency, validating the narrative that the US is under threat from resource scarcity. Mechanically, this works by creating a binary state, us versus them. In a complex system, nuance creates drag. To mobilize resources quickly, to get Congress to approve billions for Arctic icebreakers or mining subsidies, you need a clear threat vector. Greenland serves as the perfect stage. It is vast, empty, and strategically vital. By claiming that adversaries are encroaching on our Arctic backyard, the administration triggers a nationalist immune response. This creates political capital. It justifies a drift toward what analysts call constitutional authoritarianism, where external security imperatives override internal checks and balances. If the public believes the battery pack for their economy is being stolen by a rival, they will accept tougher measures to secure it. The tension with Europe is the friction heat generated by this rapid pivot. The trap for the US lies in the transatlantic fracture. By threatening tariffs or questioning NATO commitments to pressure Denmark into selling, Washington risks breaking the alliance it is trying to defend. European analysts have pointed out that treating an ally's territory as a commodity to be acquired creates deep instability. It signals that the US is willing to cannibalize its own network to secure resources. This creates a high-latency environment for diplomacy. Every time the US pushes on Greenland, trust in Brussels and Copenhagen drops. It forces Europe to consider its own strategic autonomy, potentially making it harder, not easier, for the US to access those very minerals through cooperative means. It is a brute force attack on a password-protected system. Despite the diplomatic damage, the domestic protocol remains consistent. The administration uses the Greenland crisis to centralise control. We see this in the push to streamline permitting for mines, bypassing environmental reviews in the name of national security. We see it in the elevation of critical minerals to the same status as oil reserves. The goal is to build a vertically integrated supply chain that is immune to foreign influence. The crisis is the lubricant that allows these policy changes to slide through the legislative gears. By keeping the Greenland story in the headlines, the administration reinforces the idea that the world is a zero-sum game of resource capture. It prepares the population for a future where trade is weaponized and territory is purely functional. But here is where the engineering diagram meets the real world. You can have the best strategy on paper. You can identify the perfect resource node. But if the local environment rejects the installation, the system fails. We have talked about Washington's plan. Now we need to look at the ground truth. Because buying Greenland isn't like buying a server. It's like trying to install Windows on a Mac. The compatibility issues are massive. The primary source of friction is the population. Greenland has a high degree of autonomy. The local government and the people, roughly 57,000 of them, have voting power over mineral rights. Polling suggests that over 80% of the population opposes becoming a US territory. They are not passive assets, they are active users with admin rights. Past attempts to mine uranium and rare earths in southern Greenland have toppled local governments. The Inuit Ataqatigiit Party, for example, has blocked mining projects due to environmental concerns. A hostile takeover, in the corporate sense, is impossible because there is no board of directors to bribe. There is a democratic electorate that fears the destruction of their fishing and hunting grounds. The US strategy assumes it can bypass this layer, but legally and politically, the local firewall is strong. Then there is the toxicity. Rare earth mining is chemically aggressive. It involves crushing rock and using acid baths to separate the elements. In many of Greenland's deposits, the ore contains radioactive elements like uranium and thorium. Managing the tailings, the toxic sludge left over, in an Arctic environment is an engineering nightmare. There is no infrastructure to handle it. You cannot just dig a pit. The permafrost shifts, the ice melts, and the runoff goes directly into the pristine fishing waters that sustain the local economy. The environmental cost creates a negative feedback loop. The more the US pushes for massive extraction, the more resistance they generate from the locals and the global environmental lobby. It is not a clean energy solution. It is a dirty industrial process located in one of the most fragile ecosystems on Earth. Furthermore, Greenland is infrastructure poor. There are no roads connecting the towns. Everything moves by sea or air. To build a mine at the scale the US needs, you would first have to build the ports, the power plants, the worker housing, and the roads. The capital expenditure, the capex, is astronomical. In China, the infrastructure is sunk cost. It's already there. In Greenland, you are starting from zero. This destroys the immediate ROI. Private companies hesitate to invest because the margins are too thin given the logistical difficulty. This forces the US government to subsidize the entire operation. It turns a commercial venture into a state-funded money pit. The asset is valuable, but the cost of extraction might exceed the value of the materials, at least in the short term. So the equation remains unbalanced. Washington wants the security of the minerals, but faces the friction of democracy, environment, and cost. The likely outcome isn't a purchase. It creates a hybrid state, a protectorate in all but name. The US will likely increase its consular presence, pour money into dual-use civilian infrastructure like airports, and pressure Denmark to block Chinese investment. They will attempt to lease the rights rather than buy the title. It's a subscription model rather than a one-time purchase. This allows the US to integrate the military and logistics value without taking on the full liability of governance and welfare for the population. It is the logical compromise for a system that needs the hardware but cannot afford the software upgrade. We are approaching the final calculation. When you step back and look at the whole board, the minerals, the shipping lanes, the political manoeuvring, and the local resistance, a clear picture emerges. This isn't just about Greenland. It's a prototype for how the 21st century works. We are leaving the era of free trade and entering the era of secured logistics. Imagine a simulation where global supply chains fracture completely. In that scenario, the nation with the most physical inputs within its control zone wins. The US is currently resource dependent on its primary rival. That is an unstable equilibrium. The move on Greenland is an attempt to correct this imbalance before the system crashes. It is a hedge against a total decoupling from China. If the US secures Greenland, it controls the North Atlantic Gateway and a strategic reserve of tech metals. It gains a fortress. If it fails, or if China manages to embed itself in the Arctic economy, the US faces a permanent strategic vulnerability on its northern flank. The stakes are existential for the current order of American hegemony. This is why the Donroe Doctrine will persist, regardless of who is in the White House. The style may change, less tweeting, more quiet diplomacy, but the structural imperative remains. The physics of scarcity does not care about political parties. The demand for rare earths is exponential. The supply is finite and constrained. The Arctic ice is melting regardless of climate accords. These are hard trends. The US state apparatus is reacting to these trends with a predictable logic: expansion and consolidation. They are trying to turn the North Atlantic into a closed-loop system. Greenland is the final piece of that puzzle. It is the missing component that completes the North American defensive and industrial circuit. In the coming years, expect to see more friction. You will see more headlines about partnerships, investments, and security cooperation involving Greenland. These are euphemisms for integration. The crisis will become a chronic condition, a low-level fever that justifies constant intervention. We will see the US attempting to use financial leverage to override local opposition. It will be messy. It will be expensive. But from the perspective of the machine, the US economy and military complex, it is the only logical path. The alternative is obsolescence. The system is attempting to upgrade its hardware to survive the next century. Greenland just happens to be the store where the parts are kept. To summarize, the US interest in Greenland is not a whim. It is a calculated response to three physical realities. First, the geological distribution of critical minerals needed for the energy transition and defense. Second, the thermodynamic shift of the Arctic Ocean, opening new trade vectors. And third, the geopolitical necessity of securing supply chains in a fragmented world. The Buy Greenland narrative is the user interface. The code underneath is resource determinism. We are watching a superpower realize it is running low on battery and trying to secure a charger. The irony is that in trying to secure these resources to save the liberal international order, the US is adopting the methods of the very competitors it criticizes: state intervention, sphere of influence politics, and resource nationalism. It validates the idea that, in the end, geography and geology dictate strategy. Ideology is just the wrapper. The physics of scarcity wins every time. If you understand this, the news stops looking like a circus and starts looking like a schematic. If you want to keep your own processing logic upgraded, you know what to do. Join the channel. We take apart the machine to see how it works. If you have data on Arctic logistics or rare earth processing that contradicts this model, drop it in the comments. I read the logs. Until next time, optimize your inputs.